Alright, so one of the first things I'm going to do, since I'm not dirty yet, is go ahead and take out the center console here and just expose the stuff for the shifter. First thing that I already did off camera was pull out the ashtray, just pull it right out. There's two screws, one there and then one on the other side. The other side was missing, so mine's obviously already been apart. Then the next thing you're going to do is take this around right here with the power button and stuff. Alright, now there's two screws, one down here and one down here. Alright, so now she should basically pop right out, so I'm going to use the same panel tool I've been using. Yeah, for some reason you have to have the battery hooked up for that, which is strange. Alright, so here we got it. This is basically, I think, all I'm going to need to do. I can see the screws around the shifter mechanism and everything like that, so I'm going to leave this intact for now. But I'm going to go ahead and now start jacking the car up and get everything else ready. But that basically at least gets you this part of it done. And what's kind of nice that I realized is I should be able to reuse this trim here and maybe get the insert for a manual, or maybe make my own, something along those lines. But it's kind of nice instead of having to buy this whole thing because they're insanely overpriced. I saw a broken one on eBay for like $300, which I'm definitely not going to pay. Alright, so I went ahead, got it all jacked up, got it on jack stands, shuffled stuff around a little bit off camera, just so it'd be a little more stable. But to test that it's stable before I'm going under it, I usually kick the heck out of it. The suspension flopping a little bit there, but it's solid, so it's not going anywhere. I've got jacks under the front and rear as a backup measure. And then you can see the front isn't as high because, the transmission is roughly like here, the bell housing, so right about that area is where I'm going to just pull it out and it back in, so it doesn't need to be as high, but where I'm going to slide the thing out is going to be through the back, so that's why I've got that as higher up. And it should be enough room to work, so let's slide up under here and take a look. So there's the transmission pan, and unfortunately there's no drain plug, so it'll probably be a little bit of a mess getting that thing drained. So looks like it's got a bunch of 10mm around it, so I'm going to go ahead and loosen them up. Not going to take them out, but loosen them up and then crack the pan a little bit with a flathead. Let as much of it as I can drain out. And then from there I'm going to just tighten it back up and leave whatever's left in there. I'm not taking the whole pan off because I don't really need to. I just want to make it so it's low enough so it doesn't make a mess when I'm dropping the transmission, because I'm pretty sure once I pull the drive shaft out, some of it will want to come out, so I want to avoid that as much as I can. So first thing I'm going to do is get 10mm, get the draining on that, get my drain pan, and that's why I got this cardboard down here, so you can take care of that. Alright, so what I did here is I basically went ahead and loosened them enough to where I could drop it down a little bit with a flathead, and you can see how it's coming down right now. And unfortunately I don't have really wide drain pans, so kind of positioning them where the stuff's gonna fall, but this kind of sucks. I wish I went and bought another one because it's gonna make a big mess. I guess I can still tighten them up and whatnot, but that's why I put down this cardboard, so hopefully it soaks up a lot of that. So yeah, now I'm gonna wait here as this dribbles down and then see where I go from there. Alright, so not as much was coming out as I wanted to, so I basically unscrewed everything but the passenger side ones here. I did the side ones here, the front and back, and then the driver's side one. So I'm letting it drain. It's making a huge mess, but I feel like it'll be better in the long run because then I can just slide this cardboard out and be clean. So I'm going to let that drain for as long as it needs to. I may not even continue with this until tomorrow because of how much of a mess this is already. I got ATF all over my hoodie. I think I might have some in my hair, so it sucks. It'd be much better if they had put a drain plug. I did a swap on an S13 that had a drain plug. It was a later one, but then I did a swap on another one that didn't, so I don't know what Nissan was thinking of back then, but whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and let this drain just so you can see this part is not going to be clean. Alright, so went ahead and tightened up or snugged up the bolts back up. One or two fell into the pans, but whatever, it's not a big deal. I'm not going to use this transmission again. It's just be up there so it's out of the way. And what I'm going to do now is just spray it all down with brake cleaner because there's transmission fluid all over everything down there because it was splashing and whatnot. So I'm going to go ahead and spray it down, and then I'll probably be done for now, and then I'll continue up tomorrow. Alright, so as you can see here, I skipped quite a few steps. I had a friend come over, he started helping with it, we just didn't get to film. So I'll kind of do a quick, dirty overview on the process we went through to remove it, and hopefully you can figure it out from there. Basically underneath, I started off with the drive shaft, so I went ahead and undid the 4 nut and bolts in the back, and those were 14 millimeters. You'd use 2 combo wrenches for that, and you can't get a socket in there, so you have to do that. So I unhooked those, and then from there I went to the carrier bearing here, which I believe was 17, I want to say, something along those lines. And then I also removed a shield or two that was around it, around the drive shaft, otherwise it wasn't going to drop down nicely. And let me see if I can show you that. Yeah, it's that shield right over there by the hammer. And then those are the bolts in the rear here. And then these are the nuts, 1 nut and 1 bolt to that bracket. And I believe the carrier bearing was just 2 bolts, and I put them back up into the chassis. Hi. Alright, and then once we got the drive shaft out of the way, the next thing we worked on is undoing the linkage. And the linkage, all there basically was, you'll see this rod under there hooked to the shifting mechanism. You basically just pull out this cotter pin, and then it slides right off. So there's really not a whole lot to that aspect of it. And also, you see the wiring here. I foolishly assumed they were going to be plugs that I just couldn't see until the transmission was dropped down a little bit. So once we got to the point of dropping it down, I was like, oh great. So we cut them because we know we're not going to use these. And realistically, this transmission's probably never going to be used again. There's really no market for them. This is kind of a freak transmission that nothing stateside would really ever use. So we cut them. We left plenty of slack just in case for some freak reason somebody ever wants this and they want, to resplice the harness or whatever. But yeah, so we cut those once we dropped the trans down. But what we did first is we undid the bell housing bolts. And there's a bracket up underneath there. Those silver things down there. Those are the first ones we undid around the bottom of the bell housing, and those were 14 millimeters. And then we undid all the other 14 millimeters as well. There's also ones for the starter. One of them you got from here, and the other one you got from underneath, and they're 14 millimeters as well. And then we basically got all the bell housing bolts out. There was also one that you could see from right over here, right there. That one we got out. The one up in the middle, we could not get out until we lowered the transmission down. So we undid the 17 millimeter bolts right there and dropped it down. It kind of comes down like 5-6 inches or so. And then from there we were able to use some really long extensions. I'll see if I have them handy here to show you. Yeah, so I used those extensions, so it's maybe 3 feet roughly of extensions, and then a long extendable ratchet there because it was really hard, especially being on that long of an extension. So once we got that off, we were good as far as the bell housing bolts. But we also had to drop out, prior to that, the little flex plate shield, which I don't even know where that thing ended up in all the commotion, but there's a shield that ends up sitting between the transmission and the those plates underneath there that we were able to pry out. And then there's 4 torque converter bolts that you can see there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and those were, I believe, 14 millimeters as well. And those ones we were able to use a regular deep well socket. And what we had to do for this is you can't undo them because the thing's just going to spin. So we undid the fan and then we were able to get a socket on the crank pulley to hold it. My friend held it while I loosened them up, and then he turned the motor, then I loosened the next one, yada yada. And these were just little 10 millimeters right there to pop that off, and then the belt popped off in the process, so we're going to go ahead and put that back on here soon. Right now I just kind of left it as it's apart while I take care of a couple other things. And that's what those looked like there. And the socket for the crank was, I believe, a 27 millimeter. And then we used a larger socket. If you have a shallower one, it's doable. Basically, what we did is we unbolted the fan and then moved it out of the way, just enough to get the ratchet on there. We tried initially going to like the alternator pulley and stuff, but it just wasn't working. The belt would end up slipping. And to lower the transmission down, before we undid the last bolt, we had the transmission, or we had this jack underneath the transmission pan along with some blocks of wood so it doesn't dent it and get, you know, puncture and get a bunch of fluid in our faces. So that's what we did there. We did it there, and then once we undid the last bolt and undid the lines that we needed to undo, which were 2 lines. So there was one right here that we unbolted because it was easy to get to. The other one was on the other side, not easy to get to until you dropped it down a little bit. But we actually just ended up cutting that line because we're not going to use it. We're going to remove those hard lines anyways, so it was just easier that way at the time. And then once we got all that unhooked, then we just lowered down the jack and it just came right down really smoothly. It was really smooth. One thing I did not anticipate is this giant mess here. So this one was dripping a little bit, but we just put this rag around it and assumed it'd be fine. Then I come out the next day and I got a giant mess of transmission fluid, which I wasn't really expecting because I thought I'd drained most of the transmission fluid out. Apparently that wasn't the case, so keep that in mind. Really, I should have cut that one also and then left the fitting on there and then tightened it up so it wouldn't have made such a mess, which kind of sucks. But yeah, kind of put a bunch of cat litter down to dry it up. One thing I will have to mention is this bracket right here went to the exhaust. Right there. It went to there and then also went to the transmission, along with a couple of these other brackets here. These ones there. So those ones I undid, pulled them out. But that one was actually connected to the exhaust pipe bolts that held it together. So we had to undo that because at first we tried dropping it down and it caught on that and started pulling the exhaust down. So we didn't want that. We didn't want it bending the exhaust, breaking it, whatever. So we undid those. The ones on here were easy enough. The ones actually were on the exhaust itself. Those ones we had to use an impact because they were really rusty. We were afraid they were gonna just snap if we tried a breaker bar. So we went ahead and used an impact and it zipped it right off with no problem. Didn't even put any penetrating oil on it, to be honest. I would say as far as the bell housing bolts go, the hardest ones were the top starter bolt here, the middle bell housing bolt there because you can't get to it until you drop the transmission down a little bit, and the one that was right over here, mainly because you had to use a swivel head ratchet to even get onto it, and then at that point you really only had a little tiny nub of a ratchet to get on there, so you kind of have to get up high and put all your weight down onto it to break it loose. Or if you can't do that, your ratchet doesn't fit or whatever, you should be able to get to it once you let the transmission drop down a little bit. So yeah. So at this point where we have it all apart, really there's not that much involved in it, really. You kind of just look down there, even if you've never done this before, you look up there, you see everything that's going to be in your way, and then you go from there. All the stuff came out really easy. Luckily, this car is pretty rust-free. I really had no rusty bolts to deal with except for the exhaust ones, but that happens no matter what. This car is far cleaner than any car I've ever owned underneath, so it was great not having a bunch of rust falling on my eyes and whatnot. So anyone who lives in a state that salts would really be able to relate to that. So the next thing that I'm going to be doing is removing that flex plate there, and then also in the middle, you see that bushing there, that I'm going to have to remove as well. And for that, I'm going to use a bearing puller along with a slide hammer that'll make it come out, and then I'll put the new manual one in there and put over the new flywheel, clutch kit, all that. So I have to rent the puller. I have a slide hammer, but I have to rent the puller, so I'll be doing that within the next couple days. But I'm just kind of getting an overview of where we're at right now since I wasn't able to film it. So if you have any questions on any of this, feel free to ask in the comments. I know there probably will be quite a few, so sorry I wasn't able to film it, but it's relatively straightforward if you've ever done anything similar before. Alright, so the next thing we're going to be doing is zipping off those 19mm flex plate bolts, and I'm going to do that with an impact just so they come off a little easier. Alright, so now that we got the flex plate off, we do need to take out this bushing right here. And this is going to be a hard one to take off. Generally you'll use a puller for it, but I don't know if the puller will even be able to bite onto that. So what I have done in the past is just taken a chisel and hammer and just broken it into pieces basically, which works fine. It's just time consuming and annoying. So yeah. I'm also taking a look at my rear main shield, which actually looks really clean. I'm not sure that I'm going to change that. I will probably leave that in. Alright, and then I'm checking on this just to make sure it's going to fit, which it looks like it will. So I put this in there, and then tighten the outer one here, and looks like it sticks there, so it'll work great. So I'm going to go ahead and get the slide hammer on there. This is just an attachment that I rented from O'Reilly along with a slide hammer, so this should pull the thing right out. Okay, something that I did just now is I used 2 of these to tighten that even as tight as I can go, hoping that it'll get me what I want. So let's see. Biting into the bearing like I'm wanting it to. Doing something, not giving it a gap, but scoring it. Alright, so as you can see, I finally got it out. I ended up beating the crap out of it with a mallet, which still wasn't working. I cut a couple of slits into it with a Dremel. Not sure if that had much to do with it, but then I tried to let it soak with PB Blaster, so I sprayed a whole bunch of PB Blaster into the hole here and around it and let it sit for about a half hour while I went to eat. And tried the puller again, and she pulled right out. A little crooked, but it pulled out, which I'm very happy about because it was starting to get pretty mangled right there, and I was thinking it was going to go south pretty soon, but looks like it worked out, so pretty happy with that. So now I'm going to get the new one in and start tapping it in. Alright, so now that we got that one out, I'm going to pop in the new one. The new one's actually going to go on the inside, so way up in there. So I'm going to go ahead and tap this guy in there. I basically just found a socket that fit it, and I'm going with that. I think that is it. It is tapped in there. It's about as far as she'll go, so that's all I'm going. And then now I can start putting the clutch and everything like that in and get ready to put the transmission in. Alright, so now I took off the automatic shield and I went ahead and put on the manual one here. This is from an RB25 DET, but bell housings are all the same, so this is an RB25 DE, which will work fine. So now the next thing I'm going to go ahead and move on to is this harness here, and I can see there's a zip tie there and probably a couple more going down. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this harness, get it out of the way. That way once I'm putting the transmission in, I don't get it pinched or anything like that, and then I can go ahead and look up and see what I'm still going to need out of this harness, because I'm not going to need a whole lot, so I'm not going to have this whole harness flopping around if I don't need it there. So, alright, so I went ahead and got the harness out. It basically just ran eventually up to these 4 plugs right there, the 3 there, and the one down the bottom. And you follow it along, it's got like 3 or 4 zip ties along the way. I'm kind of dumb for not looking, but They were actually reusable zip ties. You could just unclip them, but as you can see down there, I cut a bunch of them all the way except for the top one up here. So that's kind of dumb, so I just have to put some new zip ties down there. Not a huge deal, but either way, some of them were too awkward of a place to get to where I probably wouldn't have been able to easily undo them, so not the worst thing in the world. But I got the harness out, and I'm gonna go ahead and just leave it to the side for now. I know what I do need to do is the plug that this one into, these ones gotta get crossed together, or touched, or yeah, cut them and then grip them together, solder them together, whatever it may be for the neutral safety. But other than that, I'm going to have to look up and see which of these other ones I'm going to need. I'm going to cut out what I don't need because I don't want this whole giant thing for, you know, just some reverse lights. So, yeah, that's what I'm going to go ahead and do later on. That'll be probably more of a thing once the transmission's in. I'll worry about that then. Not too worried about the reverse lights, but I will like to get them working, and I would like to also eventually get a clutch switch working so it can, you know, start up by pressing the clutch instead of just turning on all the time. Because if you get the wrong person in your car, they might just turn the key right away while it's in gear or something, and she'll go, you know, flying. So, yeah, but we're making pretty good progress here. It's getting a little late right now, so I might not even continue today, but I'll see if maybe I can get the clutch on and show you guys that. Alright, and then here's my manual flywheel bolts. These are actually off of a K24 DE or E, I don't remember. I had these at my parents' house from when I did a couple swaps years back. Probably came with an engine set or so. These are the same as what comes on a RB20, RB25. So I just went ahead and used these since I had them. As far as I know, they're reusable because I have reused these in the past from part outs and manual swaps and things like that. So right now I just went ahead and cleaned them up. I filled this up with a bunch of brake cleaner, and then I just was kind of dipping them in there, shaking them about because they're kind of crusty looking. So yeah, I got those ready to go. And then now I've got my flywheel here. This is a Lighten flywheel. It came with the kit. It's an XTD kit, eBay style flywheel, eBay, Amazon, whatever. Same thing that I've got in my S13, which is K24DE. I use the factory flywheel, but I use the clutch kit. I've been using these clutch kits for the last 10 years. Truthfully, I've never had many problems. Some people say they've had problems. I personally have never. And I've also got one in my Civic and also in my Lexus too. And no issues there. So, you know, if you want to bash them, go for it. That's fine. But this is what I'm going with.